I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News InFocus. On today's show, balancing safety and justice in Canada.
Across the country, Canadians are feeling the strain of a justice system that frankly has failed to keep up with what they're feeling and what they're seeing in their communities. I remember the last time the Jays were in the World Series. I was a kid who was playing ball hockey and riding bikes with my friends until we lost daylight. We never worried about our safety, and neither did our parents. The people I talk to today, to the Chief's point, they're afraid, and I understand why.
That was Canada's Federal Justice Minister Sean Fraser speaking in Ottawa. He was answering questions about his proposed bail reform legislation called the Bail and Sentencing Reform Act. It's going to change how judges make their decisions on when a person charged with a crime is released on bail and how they're sentenced. And its success is going to depend on cooperation from provincial and territorial leaders, some of whom have already expressed their support. Here's what Manitoba's Justice Minister Matt Wiebe had to say about it on Tuesday.
I want to thank Minister Fraser and the federal government for listening and answering Manitoba's call to include these important amendments to the criminal code that will better protect our first responders every day. These amendments will ensure that anyone who assaults our first responders faces tougher penalties, and that our firefighters, our police officers, and our paramedics can do their jobs without fear or interference.
But critics say the proposed bail reform law is a step backwards. Senator Kim Pate is one of them. Pate says the bill is heavily politicized. You have members of the opposition calling for a tough-on-crime approach, and the Liberal government looking for a quick fix to a complex issue. But what will the long-term impact be? Pate knows her way around the criminal legal system. She spent the last 45 years advocating for people within it. And she joins me on InFocus from Ottawa to interrogate the bail reform bill and share a case for real change, one that involves building fewer jails and more housing and community support networks. Senator Kim Pate, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for covering this. It's so important.
So to start, I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the current state of the bail system in Canada?
Well, we know that right now the issues really are about building up community so that there are fewer people in custody. Most people who are being held in custody are there because they don't have a place to live, not because they pose an ongoing risk to public safety. And so the fact that provincial and territorial governments have called for basically more bail reform and more people to be held in custody at this moment is completely contrary to what all the evidence shows. And anybody working in the community, including many police officers, are saying, really the issue is when we're picking up people, they're often people with mental health issues, with addiction issues, they're homeless. And if we had anywhere else for them to go, that's where we would want them to be going. But they keep then accumulating, they go into custody. If it's a minor offense, they may be out very quickly, but they're still no better off and arguably worse off because they've been now held in custody, maybe criminalized as a result, and then on conditions that make them much more easy to pick up again and end up in this endless cycle in the system. So one of the things that really would have been useful to do is focus on what resources do we need in the community so that fewer people are ending up in custody, because we know our prisons are full of the people who are failed by every other system. And that's why we have a situation where, as many have said, we're talking about prisons as the new iteration, the latest, most current iteration of residential schools for Indigenous peoples. 1 in 2, 50% of the women in serving sentences, and upwards of 7 or 8 of the people remanded in custody in many parts of the country are Indigenous, particularly in the prairie provinces in the north. And the figures are even higher when we start looking at young people. And so it really reminds us that we should be looking at what are the systems that are failing, that are causing people to be literally dumped in the streets, homeless, anesthetizing themselves with drugs or alcohol to deal with the poverty, the violence that they're experiencing, and then address those issues. And then and if we really focused our resources on uh, basically holding in custody the people who cause the greatest harm in our communities, we'd be talking about a much smaller number, shorter wait times in terms of appearing, and hopefully more accountability. So the government said they were going to focus on organized crime and more serious crime. There's not, there's not a lot of evidence that that's going to be a priority, because the resources will end up going into more and more jail beds for bail revocations, with the way that these reverse onus provisions and the stricter measures are being put in place. So it's really unfortunate, because we have an opportunity to do something very different, and the government has chosen to take this route instead, which looks like it's responding. But the premiers know different. Premiers in many of the provinces know that this is not going to achieve. It's going to look like it's responding to the issues, and because there's so many people homeless and in the street, if they're scooped up and put in prison, it'll look like a response. But at some point, if they don't die in prison, they'll be coming back out. And if you take them off the street and don't provide the supports in communities, then really they're going to be worse off in the long run. And ultimately, therefore, all of us will be worse off.
And so you've mentioned earlier that, this is a very politicized issue. There are calls from the opposition to be tough on crime, that sort of thing. I'm wondering, can you speak a bit more to that and, why it's become politicized?
Yeah, I think, it's a minority parliament, and so the government is wanting to be seen to be acting on issues that people are raising. Uh, we're all concerned. I'm concerned at the number of people who are homeless, the number of people, the rising issues around mental health. But I want to see the resources go into housing and healthcare and supports, including income supports, that will help alleviate those conditions, not responses that actually make those conditions worse by maybe temporarily removing them from the public eye, but don't actually achieve anything. So, politically, it looks like a response, but it's really, I want to use the term performative, but that doesn't, that misses the devastation this causes in people's lives, families, communities, and ultimately, the country as a whole suffers when we keep going to the most expensive, least effective system. Most expensive in terms of human and social cost, but also financial cost. The amount of money that it will cost to put in place more prison beds, more people being held longer in custody, if those resources were invested in communities, in particular in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, we would see far better results long term. The challenge is, of course, that's the issue, is people, it's a political decision. People want to see an immediate response. And these sorts of interventions take a bit more time. It takes time to build resources and housing. Shoving more people in prison and overcrowding the system and having fewer people have access to programs and services as a result, having people come back into the community worse off, uh, is often a bit invisible to people, but when they're on the street, they can see them. And so, I think it's a responsibility. We need a courageous government to stand up to the political pressure and do what's right for all of us and spend our tax dollars in what the Prime Minister says he wants to do, which is be more effective in how he spends the tax dollars and not just wasting those resources. Um, this type of approach will cost a lot of money and will not achieve the result that is being promised.
So, as you mentioned earlier, we know Indigenous people are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. And, in a similar vein, how could this bill disproportionately impact Indigenous peoples?
I mean, the MMIWG and the TRC talked about the fact that we need to address the social, economic, health, and education inequality, the overwhelming, colonial history of inequality that has been put in place for Indigenous people that leads them to be more likely to be homeless, disappeared, murdered, victimized, otherwise victimized on the streets with health and in particular mental health and addiction issues, and really struggling to try and negotiate increasingly inhospitable urban communities as well. And if we invested resources in the way the TRC and the MMIWG recommended, we would see many of those supports in the community. We would see the kinds of approaches that would assist people to not be in the system. Just over a month ago, I had the opportunity and the responsibility to visit Pikangikum. And the day I was there was court day. And it was so striking, the hundreds of thousands of dollars that were spent flying everybody in, including people who were accused who were being held in custody in Thunder Bay, Toronto, Kenora. I'm not sure how many other communities. Meanwhile, there's a bail house in the community, 16 bed, not being, whether it's not adequately funded, certainly it's not staffed. And the fact that the community was asking me to look at things like the record expiry bill that we've introduced so that community members could work in those areas so that the community could have some of the resources that currently now is being expended on flying in everybody. And then, the people who were sitting in custody, many of them, it was time served. They'd served longer than they would have had as a prison sentence if they had been convicted. And so you just see this endless cycle that is incredibly costly in terms of human costs, but also financial costs. And you look at a community that has all kinds of ideas about how they could better spend that money to benefit everybody in their community, not just those who are being victimized or criminalized, but everybody in the community. And it strikes me that's the type of approach we should be taking. But politically, it's not seen as immediate, and so it looks attractive to politicians to look at an easy, however ineffective, response. And so really that's why I say we need the politicians to courageously stand up and say, look, all the evidence shows this is the wrong way to go, so we are actually going to address the issues we need to address, and really stave off and refuse to succumb to the slogans and the rhetoric that's coming to encourage us to do the opposite and to do what we know is not effective.
So the text of this bill heavily stresses the need for cooperation from provinces to make it work. And I'm wondering, could provinces potentially have the power to push back against this bill?
They could. The unfortunate reality is the provinces all joined together to call for these kinds of actions, even in provinces where we know the governments know it's the wrong way to go, that what they actually need is resources. So it's frustrating because um, you know people who have been calling for some of these sorts of approaches are politicians who have worked in other areas, whether it's been on the streets, in the prison, or in the legal system, and they know very well that this approach is not going to be effective. It's just going to look like they're responding, and in the meantime, the situation is likely to get worse. And throwing more people in prison, throwing more money into the prison system has not solved it. If that solved things, then I often say the country to the south of us would be the safest place in the world. Especially now, we know that's not true, and so all the evidence points to that we need to really focus on the missing infrastructure and support needs that people have. The fact that communities need to have housing, communities need to have opportunities for young people to be in school, to get training, that communities need to have opportunities for people to be engaging in, whether it's, you know, I heard about many communities up north wanting to do things like ecotourism and really develop, on the land programs for their young people. Those are the kinds of things that would result in fewer young people being in the system and ultimately fewer people continuing to spiral and endlessly through these systems. We need to, if we want to break these cycles, we actually have to invest in community.
And, you've spoken to this just now, but I'm wondering to close, what are some changes that you'd like to see in the justice system that would be, more effective than bail reform?
Well, every time we try to reform the criminal legal system, I don't call it a justice system because there's not a whole lot just about it right now. But every time we try and reform in a way that just changes things within the system, we actually inadvertently unintentionally end up with more people in the system. Because if that's the only place we invest, if that's the only place we put money, time, energy, and other resources, then guess what? We put more people in there. And so ever since we started focusing on the crisis of the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons, every intervention that looks like a positive reform, some that have genuinely looked like positive reforms, have resulted in more and more Indigenous people being in prison. We have to stop that. We have to stop investing in that system and instead invest in the communities. And starting in urban communities where Indigenous people are, but also in their home communities, First Nations, and communities where people, can be provided with support. So that's where we should be putting the resources. We shouldn't be building more jails or jail cells. We should be building more housing, more treatment centers, more health supports, so that we end up with people who, Canada's a rich country. There's no reason that every person can't be fed, clothed, housed, and educated. And yet, the more we put money into the criminal legal system, the more we deplete those resources in all those other areas.
Senator Pate, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Cierra, and take good care.
Members of the Indigenous Bar Association are also speaking out about the proposed bail reform bill. Rheana Worme is a criminal defense lawyer from Kawacatoose First Nation in Treaty 4 who practices in Saskatoon. And she joins me to explain how the bill could disproportionately impact Indigenous peoples and why she's particularly concerned about Indigenous youth. Thanks so much for joining us, Rheana.
You're welcome.
You're a criminal defense lawyer. What are you expecting in the courtroom if this law passes?
We already know that Indigenous people are significantly overrepresented in Canadian incarceration facilities. Indigenous women make up 50% of the federal prison population, and Indigenous youth make up 40% of all youth admissions in provincial and territorial correctional facilities. The practical application of this bill is that we are going to see more Indigenous people behind bars, not because they're dangerous, but because they can't meet bail conditions that were never designed for Indigenous people, for remote communities, or for under-resourced communities. For example, in communities where there is no bail supervision or safe housing, reverse onus becomes essentially a guarantee that they'll be detained. And we know that detention leads to more guilty pleas from innocent people who are just trying to get home. People, when they're held in remand, often plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit just to get out. And this bill risks making wrongful convictions a routine cost of being Indigenous in the justice system.
I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more about how you think this will specifically impact Indigenous youth.
I think our main concern for Indigenous youth is that this bill is going to lengthen incarceration exposure, especially for offenses that are rooted in poverty and colonial displacement, things like property crimes, theft, and survival-driven conduct. This bill is going to punish the symptom of poverty rather than addressing the cause of it. And our youth are the most at risk for these types of behaviors.
And so, going through this bill, are there any specific areas that particularly stand out to you as red flags?
I think the main concern is the expansion of reverse onus provisions. So, what reverse onus means is basically typically the law presumes an accused is innocent until the Crown proves beyond a reasonable doubt that they are guilty. And this principle is supposed to be applied to all elements necessary for conviction, including bail or show cause hearings. However, the reverse onus clause alters this dynamic by requiring the accused to demonstrate why detention is not justified. The issue with reverse onus is it creates scenarios in which a person's charter protected rights to presumption of innocence are being infringed upon. Now, typically the infringement is seen as justifiable because the reverse onus clause is currently used for circumstances of heightened public safety concerns, such as offenses related to firearms, also murder or attempted murder, and instances where the accused is already on release and commits another indictable offense. But Bill C-14 aims to expand reverse onus provisions to also include violent or repeat offenders. But we have to be cognizant of how this will affect the presumption of innocence and access to justice.
And so I wanted to play a clip of the Justice Minister Sean Fraser, who was speaking at a news conference earlier this week when he was announcing the bill, just to get your thoughts on what he had to say.
The last year that we have on record, we have seen crime come down, a violent crime come down. That is a good thing, unquestionably a good thing. In the number of years that preceded, we've actually seen crime rising and violent crime continuing to be a problem. We've also seen that your experience in this conversation depends very much where you are in the country. There are communities who have seen significant increases in home invasions and auto theft, and we believe we need to respond. Though there are other communities that may not have the same level of challenge, that doesn't mean we shouldn't respond to a very real and pressing problem that other regions within this federation are raising with us.
So, Rheana, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the minister's remarks there?
I think I share the goal of safer communities, and I do understand that, true safety and like community concerns about violence need to be addressed. But where I think I differ is that I don't see justice being served by laws that deepen inequality and ignore the context. Safety and fairness are not opposites. They depend on each other. True safety starts long before a bail hearing. We need to be investing in housing and treatment and supports in remote and isolated areas so that we can prevent crime before it happens. We can't legislate safety through incarceration.
And, this bill also changes sentencing for offenders with, repeat violent offenders may be receiving a stiffer sentence, offenses committed against first responders. And I was wondering about your comment on this specifically. It's talking about, interfering with essential infrastructure. What does this all kind of mean to you?
My concern is that essential infrastructure is overly broad, or it's a vague definition. There's no definition provided in the bill, and that we may see the criminalization of certain protests that include blockades or damaging or interfering with essential infrastructure. What does that mean? It could mean a blockade of a pipeline. Is a pipeline really essential? I wouldn't say so, but maybe the government would, or maybe the Crown would characterize it in that way. And so this could be an undue restriction on legitimate protests, especially for Indigenous demonstrations, which often target infrastructure issues.
Is there a sense that, because the language is sort of vague, that it leaves it sort of open to interpretation as to, what an essential infrastructure might be?
Absolutely. It's all going to be up to the drafters of this bill. What does essential infrastructure mean? Otherwise, it'll be left for interpretation to peace officers and courts.
Mm-hmm. And so what you've seen so far, do you think that Gladue principles will be affected by any of this?
Absolutely. Colonial impact factors, which is what those in the biz call it nowadays, must be considered at all aspects, not just for sentencing, but they should also be considered at show cause hearing and bail hearings. And we're already seeing, especially in Saskatchewan, way less Gladue reports or colonial impact reports being produced than in other provinces. And I can see that this bill will exacerbate that issue.
And so, this bill has a long way to go through committees in the Senate. And I'm wondering, is this something the Indigenous Bar Association will get involved in?
I believe so. This is something that will absolutely affect Indigenous peoples, Indigenous litigators, Indigenous criminal defense lawyers. And it's something that I know my friends at the Indigenous Bar Association will be keeping a close eye on.
Before I let you go, is there anything else that you think is important for our listeners to know about this bill moving forward?
I think just a note on Parliament being serious about reconciliation, then it must write Indigenous safeguards into this bill. Courts should have to state on the record how they've applied these sections and why those circumstances outweighed others. For example, for release of an Indigenous accused person. Transparency should not be optional, and Parliament should be cognizant of how Indigenous persons are overrepresented in carceral institutions and how they can address that.
Rheana, thanks so much for joining us on InFocus today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
This episode of InFocus was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player or email suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Homeless people aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? And why are they here? Find out in Our Relatives, Life on the Streets, hosted by me, Kathleen Martins. Listen on your favorite podcast player.